Hello and welcome to Devlog number 14. At this point in the project, I'm basically done with everything and I've got all of the events and all the code in place that basically drives the game and actually gets it to go. So that's what I wanted to go through today. I'm starting off by looking at these data types that I have, which, if you remember from the dialogue system video, are what I'm using to fill in all of the dialogue boxes that appear while you talk to Wilbur. So there are a few new booleans. The first one is yes, no. This one is actually a pretty important one, which I use mostly during the second half of the game, where the questions change from more open-ended ones to just yes or no questions. And this one's actually a little bit complicated and there's more to this one than the others, so I'll go into that one in a bit more depth. The next one is light off. This just determines whether this light object, which is on the prefab, turns on or off. If I go back to the data, the next one I've got is talking. This is just an if statement that changes whether or not the animation for his mouth opening and closing should trigger. This is useful because there are some parts where he's a bit quiet and there's just kind of like background processes happening, so I didn't want him to actually be speaking or look like he was saying them. The most important one out of all of them is has event, and then below is dialogue event with a bunch of different things which I have coded in. In terms of how this all works, I'm going to first start with the new dialogue line script. These are all the booleans that I've added and that's where they're all stored. But this variable, chat events dialogue event, is the most important. Below I also have an enum called chat events, and it lists every single event that's going to happen in the game. So obviously that means the enum is quite long. And I did have this system in mind when I didn't think the enum, or I didn't think the events were going to be as many, but that's the system I set up, and then there started being loads, and that's just where we are now. So if I head into a new dialogue system and scroll down, you'll also notice there are way more variables, which is probably the first sign that this script is way too long. Content warning for the rest of the script. I know it sucks, I know it's terrible, really inefficient, ugly, a mess. It could probably be split into 9 different scripts, I know that. But this is what we're working with because this is what I have done. And it works, so it's fine. I'm just going to start to scroll through the script and kind of highlight the things that I knew. This is the light on off boolean. You can just see that it's just turning the game object on and off. And this switch statement is the big one that determines whether or not the listed events in the enum should trigger. By using this switch statement and essentially checking if a new dialogue event, whenever the has event option here is ticked, it essentially goes through the list to figure out which one has been assigned and then does what is described in the switch statement. For the majority of these things, it is just coroutines which have a delay and turn things on and off. There's sounds, there's references to other scripts which make animations, there's game objects being toggled on and off. I'm not going to go into depth into each one because that will make this video 25 minutes long, but you can kind of see that they are all very simple. I can go into these other scripts in more detail a bit later, but you've got notification trigger, which just triggers the CCTV notification. Sometimes if I look down in the coroutine section, you can see that I'm using that same notification trigger script, but it's just doing a different function. A lot of the time where I've used a coroutine is just because I wanted to have some kind of delay before the actual function is called, and none of them are doing anything particularly fancy. The exception is the rotate one, which just rotates Wilbur on 180 degrees over the course of 6 seconds, is used as its introduction. But yeah, I will just scroll through them so you can see there's not anything particularly impressive. There is also this CCTV O2 event which goes through and actually triggers the CCTV system that was set up in that episode / in that devlog. The next thing I'm going to mention is the is yes no boolean, because that one is also pretty important. Inside the replace text function there is an if statement for whenever the current dialogue line has a response. Within that if statement is another one, which is the is yes no. The first thing this does is change the text in each response box to the text which is put in this section of the data, just like how they would originally be replaced with whatever is in these boxes. And then as I scroll down, you can see there is more of the yes no system. There's another if statement which checks if the current dialog line is yes no, and what it will do is it will trigger the yes no event. If I come down here, the trigger yes no event is actually just another switch statement, which works the same way as the other one, and instead of doing more general story related things that happens no matter what your fear type is, it does things that are a bit more specific. So whether or not you say yes or no to different questions, it's attempting to profile you, and based off of those choices it will give you different events that I've described. Again, it's a mess, it's not a great system, and it probably shouldn't be a 400-line script, but that is just where we are. It's a lot of turning game objects on and off, it's a lot of just simple coroutines and very simple things, but that is essentially how that entire script works. If I go into the hierarchy, you can see that I have an events section, and this is where all of the scripts are tied onto. I am going to take the time now to blast through and explain all of them, just because the explanations for them are so short that they don't really deserve their own video, and they're also none of them are particularly complicated systems. The first one is my notification trigger script. I've got an animator assigned to each game object which is animated, then I've just got some sound stuff, and you can see these are the functions that are being called inside of those switch statements, and all they do is play an audio source and just animator.play the right animations. If I go down to my pop-up layer and my animated notifications, you can see if I open the animation tab, these are the animations. They're quite simple. This is the setup for the animator. It's just an entry into an idle, and then this component actually has the animation assigned to it, and it's just what gets called in the script. The next one is going to be the phobia scare, which again, if I open it up, these are just arrays of game objects which I've assigned stuff to. If you look in the inspector, you can see I've just assigned a bunch of stuff to each one of them. It just has one function and one coroutine by getting the top fear and carrying out the corresponding coroutine to basically play a flash of each one of these game objects by setting them active, waiting 0.2 seconds, playing with sound, turning it off, and it does that for each image. So it basically just creates a series of flashing images as a jump scare. The next one is mouse control. This one was a little bit more complicated. The function freeze mouse just calls the coroutine freeze mouse coroutine. It gets the cursor and it locks it, and then it spawns this loading sprite, which I've also assigned. It's just an animated little GIF of a loading symbol, which I made myself. Waits for 5 seconds and then turns the cursor back on, letting you control it. It was a little bit tricky because you have to obviously find the location of the mouse in order to spawn the loading wheel there, but again, it's a very small script. The next thing is the event_death counter, and that also has its own script. This one was a little more complicated just because I had to do a bunch of maths, and essentially after deciding how long I wanted the counter to be, I had to convert those numbers into hours, minutes and seconds by dividing them up and making sure that they would sit in the text nicely. All of the coroutines and functions don't do anything too special, they just turn game objects on and off and have delays. And this coroutine here at the bottom just moves the entire game object up so that I can have the counter creeping onto the screen. The next thing is download O2, which isn't actually really an event that is a profiling based one or is one that you can avoid. It just spawns in another loading bar like the one that's used at the beginning, and it just adds progress to it so it looks like it's downloading itself. As you can see here with the function auto download, it just adds an amount, waits, adds an amount, so it just looks like it's downloading in the background. The next one is wallpaper changer, which does something similar to the phobia scare, where it gets the top fear and then based off of that, it will then set the appropriate game object based off of what I've assigned to be active. All of those are just sitting in this game object here, waiting to be toggled on and off. The final event is OS deletion, which is the thing that happens at the very end of the game, which again is just another coroutine which creates an array of all of the game objects in the scene. It looks at each game object, checks if it has the tag delete, spawns in this glitch just as a special effect, puts it in front by setting it as the last sibling, has a delay, turns that object off, and then destroys the effect. And it does that for each game object in the scene, which basically just makes the OS look like it's being deleted. There's a lot of detail that I've missed, but the whole point of this video was just to communicate the method that I have used to actually get things in the game to happen, and the main way that the game actually progresses. So that was just it for this video. I hope that my scripts weren't too offensive. And as you can see, there are just loads of game objects. Each glitch and pop-up and event essentially has its own game object, which gets turned on or off in some way, shape or form. And that is essentially how my game operates, which is fine. So yeah, that is it for this devlog. I know it's kind of a long one just because there is a lot of small things that I had to go through, but it could have been way longer, and I just wanted to communicate the main method that I have used to approach getting my game to actually progress. But thank you for watching, and goodbye!